Today's daf today we're going to learn is Pesachim Kuf Tet Vav. Okay, reminding everyone about the siyum. Please register. You can go on the site. Already more than 550 people are registered, so keep them coming. That's just in the English. There's another 100 or so in the Hebrew. So register, enjoy, come and celebrate with many, many, many other people. Okay, we're going to get started now with the bottom of Daf Kuf Yud Daled, where we started yesterday. We're really now in the Seder, what's happening at the Seder. We're going to learn about all different customs that we do and some that you might be surprised about. In fact, right now, we're going to learn something very surprising. So yesterday, we kind of learned, and it seemed like what you would have expected, which is we started at the end with pshita. It's obvious that if you're going to take shar yirakot, other vegetables for Carcass, then you're going to make a borei pri adama when you say the Carcass, and then you're going to say alachilat maror when you get to the maror, which is exactly what we do. But what happens if you only have the same vegetable that you're using both for the maror and for the Carcass? So again, the same thing. It makes sense. We already said in the beginning, you're talking about Carcass. Your focus is not on the maror. At the end, you say alachilat maror when you get to the maror, because you're not doing the mitzvah of maror when you're eating it, even though theoretically you're doing the exact same thing. You're eating, let's assume it's lettuce. You're eating lettuce and you're eating lettuce. It's the same thing. So Matkifla Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, what are you talking about? We're now at the top of our daf. After you already filled up your stomach with this, in other words, you already ate the maror. It's true, you were in the part of the Haggadah called Carcass, but you ate the maror. So you're going to make another blessing now later, eat the same food and make a different blessing on it? It seems very odd. So Ella Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda therefore has a different opinion. And he says, at the beginning, fascinating. Okay, and you're going to think, we obviously don't do this, right? He says in the beginning, you make a borei pri adama, and then you make an alachilat maror when you're in the Carcass section. Then what do you do when you get to maror? So what does he say? Will of a self. When you get to the time when you're supposed to eat maror, what do? You eat the maror, you just don't make a bracha on it because you already made the bracha from before. So you still eat it to symbolically say, well, this is the place in the Seder where it belongs. But your blessing you already made in the beginning, because it's ridiculous to eat the same food and one time, kind of call it Carcass and don't make the blessing on maror, and the next time you do, it doesn't make any sense. You already ate it. So you say the bracha on the maror at the beginning. Seems very odd, and you would assume we don't obviously hold this way, but you're going to be a little bit surprised. B'Surya avdei Rav Huna. Okay, so in Surah, it's probably not Surya, it's probably Surah, I think. But Besura, which is the city in Bavel, they did like Rav Huna. Rav Sheshet, Berei de Rav Yeshua, avdei Rav Chisda. Rav Sheshet, he held like Rav Chisda. Now, the Gemara tells you, which, as we all know, we always want to know, what do you do? What do you do? It doesn't tell us in the Gemara, but here they in fact tell you, the Hilchatat Kabatei de Rav Chisda. We actually hold like Rav Chisda, believe it or not. Now you might say, what are you talking about? We never do this. But why don't we never do this? Because we're never in this situation. Because we never use the same vegetable for Carcass and maror. We always use something else for Carcass and something different for maror, and we don't use something that can be used for maror. So this is, I think of this example all the time. I had a teacher, I was learning in the scholars program at Lindenbaum many years ago, and we had a teacher who was very knowledgeable, very Talmid Chacham, and he told us his story where he was learning with a Chavruta Mishnah Brura in the morning, and they get to this part in the Mishnah Brura. I'm sure I've mentioned this in class before because it always just stuck with me. So if you've heard it again, I'm sorry. But he said that they were learning this halacha about what do you do when there's no Levi in shul and who gets the aliyah of the Levi. And if there's a Kohen, right, the Kohen gets the first two aliyah. So to which the rabbi he was teaching, he says to his chavruta, but we don't do this. And his friend looked at him like he was crazy. He said, what do you mean we don't do this? Of course we do this. This happens all the time. And he said, I've never seen it. And then he realized, well, I'm a Levi. So I've never seen it because I'm a Levi and I've never been in that situation because I could never be in shul when there's no Levi in shul. It's just impossible. So here you have someone who's very knowledgeable, but if you've never been in that situation, so you might not know that halacha because you've never come across it. Same reason why many women don't know anything about Hilchot Tefillin and Tzitzit because it doesn't apply to them. Right? So it's the same idea. You can be very knowledgeable, but know almost nothing about these topics because it's one of the reasons it's good to learn Daf Yomi. You get to see everything. So it says here, so that is in fact the halacha. We hold like Rav Chisda. It's just that we never end up in this situation because we never use the same vegetable. Now, if the Mishnah had suggested you could use the same vegetable, why don't we ever use the same vegetable? Well, for that, we have the next line. Rav Acha berei de Rava, mehader ashar yirakot afuke nafshe miplugta. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, and it seems like his custom became the rule. He said, I'm always going to try to find other vegetables to use for Carcass so I don't get stuck with this halachic quandary. Do I make a bracha on achilat maror in the beginning or don't I? Even though the Gemara had said the halacha is like this, first of all, he didn't necessarily see that. We don't know who added that line and when it was added. And also he said, better not to get into any kind of doubt situation. So why don't we just create a situation where that never happens? And that's why it seems, that's why we do what we do, which is we never end up with the same vegetable for Carcass and maror, even though theoretically one could, but then you'll get into this halachic quandary of what do you do with the bracha b'achilat maror? And even if we paskin like Rav Chisda, it does seem a little bit strange to be blessing on the maror in the beginning of the Seder and not where in its proper place. Amar Ravina. Now we're going to have another topic, which is do this. Now we're going to get to the famous Hillel sandwich that we eat at the Seder, right? So just to go through what we do at the Seder. First, we eat matzah by itself. Then we eat maror by itself. And then we eat matzah and maror together. And we say, Zecher l'mikdash ke-Hillel. We want to remember what Hillel did in the time of the mikdash. And so it was a little bit strange. Hillel lived in the time of the temple. Was it only him who made a sandwich? Did everyone eat a sandwich then? Is he the one who kind of said we should remember the temple? Probably not, because he lived in the time of the temple. So what exactly is going on here? And we're going to see that even though we're going to learn through this sugya, there's different ways to read it. Those in the skills class know this a little more in depth, and it'll be a good review. If you remember, this all is based on this verse. You're supposed to eat the Pesach with matzah and with maror. Okay, those who came to last night's class know we discussed what's the reason for that, right? There's all different answers about what exactly the reason is. Maybe we'll get to when we get to the end of the Masechet, not for today. So Amar le Rav Misharsha Berei Rav Natan, Hachi Amar Hillel Mishmei de Gemara. Now this is a little tricky because you think we're talking about Hillel, the Hillel that we know, but he's going to say the exact opposite of what Hillel says. And it's clear that this Hillel is an Amora. It's not Hillel, who's the Hillel Azaken, who's the famous Hillel that Beit Hillel comes from, and was the one who lived in the time of the temple. No, this is a different Hillel who is passing on a tradition. Mishmei de Gemara means he had a tradition about this. So what did he say? Lo nikroch inish matzah umaror bahade adade v'nechal. You cannot put matzah and maror together and eat it. The exact opposite of the Hillel sandwich. You can't put them together. Why? Mishum desviralan, because he holds, and now he's talking after the time of the temple. And this is what we learned last night in the skills class, and we'll see it on Daf Kuf Chaf, a few more days. Matzah bizman hazeh deoraita, umaror de Rabbanan. Matzah nowadays is by Torah law. Maror is only rabbinic. Okay, now I want you to notice before, desviralan is he holds. Now what we learned last night in the skills class is there's a machloket about this. Some people think that both are rabbinic only nowadays. Why would there be a difference nowadays and in the time of the temple? Because in the time of the temple, you're supposed to eat it with the sacrifice. The question is, once there's no longer a sacrifice, are you still obligated by matzah and maror by Torah law? So according to Hillel this Amora, he held, matzah bisman hazeh is doraita. Matzah is a Torah obligation still, even without the temple. There's a separate, it's important to eat the matzah with the Pesach, but there's also a mitzvah by itself. And that's if you didn't eat it with the Pesach, meaning if you don't have the sacrifice anymore. Umaror de Rabbanan, but maror, it's only rabbinic. Ve'ate maror de Rabbanan, umevata leila matzah de oraita. Comes the maror that's rabbinic in nature, that the obligation is only rabbinic, and it nullifies the matzah that's de oraita. Okay, a big question here. Okay, this will be a good review of those in the skills class. What's going on here? How does one nullify the other? Okay, and why is it the rabbinic one that nullifies the Torah? You would think Torah is more important. That should nullify the weaker one. So a few different explanations are given. One is to say, what's nullification that's going on here? Where do we see that mitzvot nullify each other? Is it all mitzvot? Or if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, the first line on the daf, he says, it's the taste of the maror that overrides the taste of the matzah. It's an issue of taste, which is all the laws of bitul in general that apply to kashrus. When you have one flavor and it's more flavor than the other, it can nullify the other one. That's why we have bitul b'shishim. Shishim is the amount, a 60th is the amount that we assume you don't taste it anymore. It's too little. So this is a classic issue of bitul. It doesn't really have to do with mitzvot. It has to do with food-related mitzvot, and then it would only apply in food areas. And why then is the maror nullifying the matzah? Because the maror has a stronger flavor. Right? Because that's why. Matzah is kind of bland, and it's not the flavor that's important in the matzah. It's the maror. We'll see that later in today's daf. So that's one explanation. Another explanation is, no, we're talking about mitzvot in general. You can't degrade a mitzvah. Mitzvot each have their own level of importance. And then it's going to depend where you go with this, whether you say mitzvot do nullify, mitzvot don't nullify. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is saying basically a rabbinic, if you put a rabbinic law next to a Torah law, that's going to cause the Torah law to become less significant because you're putting it with something that's less important than it. And that minimizes the importance of the Doraita. And that's why the rabbinic nullifies the Torah law. Okay, so that's what he says. Don't put them together because the maror is going to take away from the significance of the matzah. Okay, that's his opinion. Now they tell you, afilu leman da'amar, even to those who hold. We're now going to learn there's another machloket. When you say leman da'amar, usually that implies there's a debate about this. Even if you say mitzvot ein mevatlot zo et zo, we don't generally think that mitzvot nullify each other. But when is that the case? That's only when they're the same level mitzvah. Okay, so that means if you say mitzvot aren't mevatlot zo et zo, then let's say you're living in the time of the temple, you're supposed to eat matzah, Pesach and maror. You can eat them all together because they don't nullify each other. But but even if you think that mitzvot don't nullify each other, in this case they would, because when you say mitzvot don't nullify each other, you mean two equal commandments. You can put two equal commandments together. That's totally fine. But when you have two different levels, then we're going to say that one nullifies the other. So therefore, we're going to say that what Hillel said here is really according to even the one who says the mitzvot don't nullify each other. He would still think that they do. Nowadays, you can't put matzah and maror together. So now we want to know, since he mentioned that there's even if you say mitzvot don't nullify each other, we want to know who's the one who says that. Mantana deshamat le mitzvot ein mevatlot zo et zo. Who's the one who says that mitzvot don't nullify each other? And now they tell us Hillel. And now we're jumping back to the original, the Hillel Hazaken, the elder. It's Hillel. How do we know? He thinks that mitzvot don't nullify each other. Because now, if you think mitzvot nullify each other, then you can't eat the matzah sandwich with the maror and the Pesach, even in the time of the temple, because you have three different mitzvot, eating matzah, eating maror, eating Pesach, and you can't then do them together. Now, why did we think you could do them together? So first of all, we think that because we do this every year at the Seder. So we assume that they eat it together. So we're kind of biased by what we know to be the case. So when we read the pasuk that you're supposed to eat the meat, tzli roasted, al matzot umurim yochluhu, you have to eat it with matzot and maror. We assume that means with as a sandwich. But who said that? It says you're supposed to eat it with. With could just mean at the same meal. Eat your Pesach, eat your matzah, eat your maror. Just don't eat them all together because then you're going to take one is going to take away from the significance of the other. You can see that, right? If you strip three things together, you're already minimizing the significance of each one. Again, one could argue the other. No, it's ideal. In this case, we want to specifically put them all together. Okay, in the skills list, we discussed there's a few different reasons why you put them all together. Right? So one reason is that the Shiur says on the Pesach that you want to combine these ideas of the bitterness, the suffering, the freedom, which is the Pesach, the Matzah symbolizes, and the redemption, which the Pesach symbolizes. And those three, you want to eat them all together at the same, right? You want to combine them. Some people say that's how, I read last night in Rabbanit, I actually didn't read this one part that I should have read, which is that he says the sacrifices often the meat came with matzah. It was the way many sacrifices are brought with matzah. And the maror was this added thing that would make the meat taste better, to have something bitter with it. And it was an idea of having something that would be olel shulchan melachim, like a king's feast. That's how they ate things. And therefore, also maybe you would say it should be together. That's the ideal way to do it. But anyway, according to this, we're going to see that there's a debate about did they even eat it together in the time of the temple? It's unclear from the sugya. It depends how you read the sugya. But now we're going to say Hillel is obviously the one who thinks the mitzvot don't nullify each other because he said in the time of the temple, D'Tanya, Amru alav al Hillel, it says in a Braita, they said about Hillel, Shayat korcham bevat achat v'ochlan. He would make them together as a sandwich and would eat them. Shenemar al matzot meruim yochluhu. Okay, so Hillel says this, which means it's obvious he doesn't think that mitzvot nullify each other, even when they're on the same level. Okay, now, specifically, I should say it, when they're on the same level. When they're on different levels, he'll still say it's a problem. And that's why he thinks nowadays we shouldn't be doing that. But in the time of the temple, you could. How does this relate to mitzvot, chavilot? That's a good question. Rav Shechter had said that it's not the same. Mitzvot, chavilot is using the same object for several mitzvot, like 1 cup of wine to say on it a bunch of things. That's his answer to the difference between them. And this, again, one could raise a question on what he says, but this is what Rav Shechter says, and I think it's at least a good convincing answer right now, which is this is doing different mitzvot together. That's not the same. We're not using one object to cover several mitzvot. That's the idea. You want to kind of like strip it all together so that it's not a burden on you and you don't have to buy another cup of wine. And, you just kind of put it all together in order to save money, save time. This is a little bit different. It's not the exact same concept because you're using different objects of mitzvah. So that's what he claims the difference is. But it is a question exactly what the relationship between this sugya and that sugya is. That was the best answer that I found in my research. Okay, so we said, who's the one who holds mitzvot don't nullify each other? It's Hillel, because in the time of the temple, he would eat it as a sandwich. Again, we said before in the sugya that according to Hillel the Amora, you can't do it nowadays because even if you say the mitzvot don't nullify each other, they do when it's 2 different levels. So even Hillel would agree now it's more of an issue. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Cholkim alav chavirav al Hillel. Not everybody agree with Hillel. Okay, now, what exactly they disagree with is a good question, but it seems like he's saying that they thought mitzvot nullify each other. And even in the time of the temple, they didn't eat everything together. So you probably came into the Shiur thinking that everyone ate it that way in the temple. It's just that Hillel decided we should remember, right? It was based on Hillel that we should remember, we should do it for future generations. But really, no, it's an issue. Did they do it in the temple like this or did they not? And we're remembering the way Hillel did it as a way of remembering what he did, but not necessarily everybody did that. How does he know that Cholkim alav chavirav al Hillel? And he brings a very strange source because it's can't really be proven from here that they disagree with him. Why? We'll see as we read. Tanya, it says in the following bright. You might have thought you could put them together the way Hillel does it, or you're supposed to put it together the way Hillel did. Talmud Lama, what do they learn from here? You should eat it, meaning singular, even though it's talking about 2 different things. Even if you eat them separately, meaning, now this is weird. He wanted to prove you can't eat them together, but this doesn't prove that the rabbi told you can't. This seems to say you don't have to, but you can. Afilu means even if you wanted to eat them separately in the time of the temple, you could. So to which Rav Ashi attacks him and says, Matkev la Rav Ashi, hachi my afilu. What's this afilu? That doesn't prove your point that they thought you couldn't. It just meant you could if you wanted to. You don't have, you could eat them separately if you wanted to. You don't have to eat them together. That doesn't prove that mitzvah nullify each other because that seems to imply you actually could eat them together. You just don't have to. So El Amar Rav Ashi, and there's a bunch of different ways of reading this, but Hai Tana, Hachi Katana, there's a few different gersot of those words, but he's saying, don't use this braita to prove that people disagree with Hillel, to which the Rashbam says he doesn't think that they didn't disagree with him. He just thinks this source doesn't prove it. Okay, and he's going to say, Rabbi Yochanan must have had a tradition that they disagree with him, but we don't have a source to prove it. But this source clearly doesn't prove it. Because this source says, and according to the Rashba, this braita goes with Hillel. And what does Hillel say? You can eat them together, and maybe it's ideal to, but if you ate them separately, you could. Do the rabbis disagree with him? They do. We just don't see that here. That's just not proven from this braita. It must be known from somewhere else. Some people think that this is actually coming to say the rabbis actually don't disagree with him. And they disagree with him about the sandwich. He says, you must eat the sandwich. It's the only way to fulfill the mitzvah. And they said, you can, you don't have to. And their debate with him isn't about do mitzvot nullify each other. Nobody thinks that mitzvot nullify each other. And everybody thinks in the temple, you could eat them as a sandwich. It's a debate whether they did, you have to, or you don't have to. And that's a different debate. So there's 2 ways to read the sugya, and you come to a very different conclusion. Because the whole question is, right, it's interesting, we're arguing about what actually happened in the temple. Did everyone eat a sandwich? And, other than those who just didn't want to and didn't have to, Or was there a split? And some people think you had to eat them together, and some people thought you were not allowed to eat them together. Okay. And then you have to would be, well, you should, but you don't have to. And the other side would say you absolutely can't. Okay. So there's a bit of a debate about how to read this sugya, which really is important in terms of what exactly they did in the temple. So now the Gemara comes to this conclusion at the end. We don't really know. Now let's just assume that in the end, we're saying the rabbis disagreed about do mitzvot nullify each other or not, and did they eat the sandwich in the time of the temple? Didn't they eat the sandwich in the time of the temple? Can you put these together? Can you not put them together? So since the halacha was not like Hillel, not like the rabbis, mevarech ala chilat matzah v'achil, v'hader mevarech ala chilat maror v'achil, v'hader achel matzah v'chasa v'hade hadade below bracha zecher lemikdash kihilel. Now, how is this a compromised shita? If you had held like Hillel, what would you have done? So remember, Hillel says, and this is a good review of the sugya, if it's the time of the temple, you eat them together. If it's not the time of the temple, right, which could mean you have to or you can, right, and it's ideal. When it's not the time of the temple, we already said, even if you hold the mitzvot don't nullify each other when they're all d'oraita, or d'Rabbanan, but when it's two different levels, which it is nowadays, they're going to nullify each other, right? And what's going to nullify what? The maror is going to nullify the matzah. So if you're Hillel, what would you do nowadays? You can't, they're going to nullify each other. So you can't do them together. So you have to do them separate. But what could you do according to Hillel that's different from here? In other words, why does this have to be a compromise? Why don't we just say this sounds like Hillel? Exactly. Because if you're Hillel, what happens? First, you eat matzah. You have to eat matzah separately according to Hillel and those who disagree, because again, everyone agrees the maror is going to nullify the matzah. But once you finish the matzah, you're now left with, well, your matzah now is only rabbinic in nature because you've already dealt with your Torah. Now you have rabbinic. You can theoretically already eat the sandwich now, because when you eat the sandwich, the maror won't nullify the matzah, and the matzah won't nullify the maror because they're both d'Rabbanan. And according to Hillel, they don't nullify each other, d'Rabbanan. So theoretically, you could have eaten the sandwich now. That's why we say, since the rabbis disagree and think that they will nullify each other, even d'Rabbanan, therefore we have to first eat the matzah separately, then eat the maror separately, and then if we want to remember the sandwich that Hillel ate, then we have to do them both together, only at the end. And that's the conclusion, and that's exactly what we do at our Seder. So we now learned about this custom. The next thing we're going to learn about is why we wash our hands before Carcass, right? It's strange washing. We wash, we don't make a blessing. What's this all about? So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rav Shaya, Kol shetibulo b'mashket tzarich nitilat yadayim. If we're back to laws of purity and impurity, if you dip something in a liquid and then you touch the liquid, okay, that's what we're talking about at the Seder. What do? You dip it in a liquid, the Carcass. You then touch the liquid. What happens? Do you remember we talked about yadayim askaniotim? Your hands touch lots of things. We assume the rabbis instituted a takana. Usually your whole body has to become tameh, but your hands are dealt with separately according to the rabbis, and they can carry truma of what we call sheni l'tuma, yadayim shniot, which means usually they only mess up truma and kodshim. But if they touch a liquid, remember what liquid does? There's this serad d'Rabbanan, that liquid jumps things up a level, which means that the object now becomes, the liquid becomes a rishon, which means it can be matame food. So if I touch food that's wet, what happens? Food that like in this case, a vegetable. If my hands are tameh, I touch the liquid becomes a rishon. It makes the vegetable a sheni. Now, why do we care? Well, because there were rabbis, the Prushim, if you remember, they kept things, they treated things as if we have to worry about purity and impurity, and they didn't like to create impurity of their food. So therefore, anything that tibulo b'mashket, that you dip in a liquid, needs netilat yadayim. So Amarav Papa, Shma Mina, you can infer from here, Hai chasa, this lettuce that we eat at the Seder, that we're washing our hands for, they're actually talking about the Carcass right now. It's interesting, they dipped it in charoset. They dip it in charoset mishum kappa. This is going to come up on the next page, why we dip in charoset. According to this is one of the reasons given. It's because there was a poison in there. Many people think it was worms that were in there that we need to kill. And when you dip it into the charoset, it kills the worms that are in the vegetables. And I'm not going to get into this whole issue. Well, if they're dead, they're also a problem. There's all different answers given for this. And I don't want to focus on that right now. But you dip it in the charoset because of the kappa, and it must be l'shakue. It has to be entrenched in there in order to kill it. Why? Because if it wasn't entrenched, think about it. When you do Carcass, You dip the vegetable in, let's say you take a stalk of celery or parsley or something like that. You dip part of it in, you're not actually touching the water. You're not coming in contact with what you dipped it in. So therefore they say it must be, you need to dip it entirely, because if you didn't dip it entirely, then you wouldn't have this issue of washing your hands. You're not even touching the liquid. The whole problem is touching the liquid. Because if you think you didn't need to submerge the whole thing, what do you need netilat yadayim for? Halonaga, you didn't even touch it, right? If you touch food, it's not a problem. Sheni doesn't transfer anything to food. Only if you touch the liquid and the liquid becomes a rishon, that's because this whole zerat mashkin that we learned about a while ago in the beginning of Masechet Shabbat. But because of that, it will create, the food will become a sheni. So they say, no, you don't have to assume that. You don't need to submerge the whole thing in its entirety. How do you get rid of this kappa? It's just from the smell of it. And as soon as you dip a little bit in it, it gets wind of the smell, and that's what kills this poison. So therefore, we're back to square one. So what's the reason then? If you're not going to get the whole thing wet, you can touch the dry part and you don't have to worry about it. Dilma mishakule. We're worried that maybe you'll end up submerging more of it, and maybe you'll end up touching the liquid, and maybe you'll end up making it impure, and that's the problem. Okay, so now we understand, even though it's hard to understand this entirely, but why they decided that you need to wash your hands before you dip. Okay, it's interesting here, they talk about charoset. We usually think of charoset as not a liquid, but they're obviously calling this charoset a liquid. Okay, that's clear from here, because if it wasn't a liquid, we wouldn't have this issue. But Amar Papa. Lo nishe inish maror b'charoset. By the way, another thing, don't leave the maror in the charoset very long. Why? Dilma agav chalye detavlin ma mevatale lemarore. We're worried, and here we get to the importance of tasting the maror. The maror is bitter, and we want to taste that bitterness. If you leave it in the charoset for too long, it might take away the bitterness of the maror, and we don't want that to happen. Ubi'inan tal maror v'leikan. You need the taste of maror, and we don't have it if you do that. So therefore, make sure not to leave it too long. Some people, right, shake off all the maror. It comes up in the psak halacha, all the charoset. You're not supposed to leave any charoset. You dip it symbolically, and then you take off all the charoset. Okay, so first of all, if you say it's mishum kappa, it makes sense. You want to just kill it out, but then you get rid of it because you don't really need it. If you say it's zecher latit, which we're going to see this, the cement, then you might actually want to be eating that, because again, what does it mean zecher? Maybe you just dipped it. That's enough of a remembrance. So it's it seems here, by the way, I see what you're asking, that the beginning we were talking about dipping the Carcass and the washing before the Carcass. Then we seem to be moving to the maror. Okay, so it seems like we're talking about both here. And now we're going to really get to, because it's clear here that you need to wash your hands before both, and that's why we have orchatz, and we also have rachza. Now you'll say, well, rachza really goes on the bread, right? But theoretically, okay, you really didn't necessarily need another washing. And that's going to be the question of the Gemara here. If you already washed your hands at the beginning of the meal, why do you need to wash your hands again? So first, let's just explain these words. Adbare means he gave him permission to give a drasha or something like that. Okay, Rav Chisda gave permission to Rabbanit Ukva to give a drasha. Why did he need permission, right? Anyone who wants to get up can go teach if they want. Why did he need his permission? So who's Rabbanit Ukva? Rabbanit was a term, Rabban was a term given to the Nasi, president, like the head of the Beit Midrash, or the Jewish, like the Chacham kind of thing, or Nasi was like a kind of in-between category. The Reish Galuta was called the Rabban. He's the exilarch. Remember, he wasn't usually a Talmid Chacham. So maybe that's why he needed permission, because he wasn't really the kind of person that gives a drasha normally. But Rav Chisda allowed him to do this. Or maybe Rav Chisda taught him this so that Rabbanit Ukva could teach everybody else. Either which way, let's read what he told him. Natal yadav b'tibul rishon, notel yadav b'tibul sheni. If you washed your hands in the beginning, now we're assuming, okay, this is a debate. Is he talking about during the year, or is he talking about the Seder? We don't really know yet. So right now, let's just leave it as we don't know. He says, if you washed your hands the first time you dip some vegetable, and then you dip again, you have to wash your hands the second time. We'll have to see why this is. So the rabbis brought this statement to Rav Papa, and he said, he must be talking about on a regular night and not on Pesach night. Why? Now, what would be the issue? When you wash your hands, you have to know what you're washing your hands for. I'm washing my hands now to eat a vegetable that I want to dip in water. If I decide later, now we're going to learn tomorrow that in general, nowadays we don't dip at all. And that's why in the 4 questions we ask, on all other nights, we never dip. And tonight we dip twice. In those days, we're going to see tomorrow, when we're going to get to the Manishana and what questions they asked in the Mishnah, the Nusach is different. They said on all other nights we dip once. On this night we dip twice, meaning they never dipped twice. So what is he saying? Basically, he says, Christopher Papa says it must be time out on all other nights. If you're going to dip twice, when you dip the first time, you weren't thinking, when you washed your hands, you weren't thinking about the second dipping. Your washing has to be with intent on what you're planning to do with that. So the assumption is you ate one vegetable and then you were done, and then you decide to eat another one. Well, that's a whole new thing. And it's called what we've seen before, Heseh Chadat. You already forgot about it. You already weren't thinking anymore about, now, what do you need to think about here? Because you want to keep your hands clean. And therefore, that's why we don't talk between washing and hamotzi, because you have to remember not to touch anything on the way. You just wash your hands, you purify them. You want to make sure you don't touch anything else. But if you're going to decide to dip later on a regular night, you weren't including that in your first one. But on Pesach night, right? In this case, you already washed your hands once and you knew you were going to do 2 dippings. Everybody knows there's 2 dippings on Pesach. So you had in mind the second dipping and you wouldn't need to wash again. Amar lehu Rav Papa, Adraba. Rav Papa said no. And this the rabbi said to Rav Papa. Rav Papa now responds and says, what? No, it's the opposite. Hacha itmar. He was talking about specifically on Pesach. How do I know that? They never dip twice on any other night. So he wouldn't be telling you something that never happens or is so rare. So it must be, he's talking about a night when you dip twice and that you need to wash before the first and you need to wash before the second. That's what Rav Ashi says to his students. Ella. So now the question, Ella, my ha'acha itmar. Netilei yadayim trezim ne'lamali. But now we're back to square one. Why do you need netilei yadayim twice if you knew that there were going to be 2 dippings? So they right, hamasha leyad echad dizim. You already washed your hands. Amre, they said, kevan debai lememar agadat halela dilma asuche asche ledate v'naga. And this explains why we do netilat yadayim twice. Because in between, a lot of time passes. You said the divrei agadata, which means the Haggadah, right? We said all the stuff of the Magi. We said Hallel, right? We say 2 sections of Hallel before. We've had a long time elapse, and you're not really focused on your hands the whole time. You're focusing on the Seder and what you're doing. And it could be that your hands touched something and became impure again. And that's why, because of the time that elapsed and that you're busy doing other things, you clearly were not thinking all that time about your hands being clean. And that's why you need to wash your hands a second time. Next topic. Amarava. Bala matzah yatsa, bala maror lo yatsa. If you swallow matzah without chewing it, meaning you don't taste it, right? You ever have disgusting medicine? And what do? You try to, right? You hold your nose and you chug it down your throat so that, or you're giving your kids, right? Say, okay, hold your nose, quick, chug it, don't think about it. And then you don't really taste it. Is there an issue that we want you to taste the matzah? We want you to taste the maror, right? We know with afikomen, you're supposed to leave the taste of the matzah in your mouth. So we do have some issue of taste. And we talk about, you want to come into the Seder. We talked about this in the very beginning, so that you have matzah b'te'avon and you're excited to eat the matzah. But they're going to say, according to this sugya, bala matzah yatsa. You can swallow it, not taste it. It's not really the taste that's important. However, when it comes to maror, we already explained it's taste that's important. Therefore, bala maror, if you swallow the maror without tasting it, lo yatsa. The whole point of the maror is to taste it. The matzah has other significances just to eating matzah, not necessarily that you need the flavor of the matzah. It's not the taste that's important. What if bala matzah umaror? Let's say you ate them together. So yedei matzah yatsa, yedei maror lo yatsa. Same thing. Okay, if you eat them both at the same time, now why? This should be obvious. We already said you don't need the matzah taste. You do need the maror. But here they're thinking that maybe because you ate it with maror, maybe it would have nullified the matzah, like it would take away even more from it. But no, they say it's not a problem. But okay, let's say you put it, okay, I'm thinking this is obviously different. You wouldn't eat this, but let's say you put something in a sock bag, right? And then you're not actually touching it when it goes in your mouth. I mean, obviously you wouldn't put a sock bag in your mouth, but if you wrapped it in something that was edible, okay, seaver like fibers from a tree, it must have been edible fibers. If you were to wrap it in there and then it doesn't even touch your throat at all or your mouth, right? It's inside something. Then already that's not, and you swallow it and you don't taste it and you don't chew it and you don't and it doesn't even touch your mouth, then already it's going to be a problem even for the matzah. Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi. Now we're going to talk about how they sat at the table. We're kind of jumping from topic to topic. When they sat at their tables, everybody had their own table in front of them. Okay, it wasn't like nowadays. We talked about this before. People ate. That's how just they ate in general. Everyone had their own table. Whenever they talk about taking away the table, it means they cleared off the dishes. It's basically a way of saying that. So now they say, how if everyone had their own table, how did it work? Everybody had their own personal Seder plate in front of them. Notice there are 6 things on the Seder plate here, right? There's only 3. But he says, right, everybody had their own thing in front of them. But despite that, when we get to this point, we're going to talk about in a minute, that they would take off the table, it's called, which we do now. We remove the Seder plate from the table, right? We do that. That's why we do it. We'll see why in a minute. But when we talk about doing that, we don't mean everybody. And it's, even though everybody has everything in front of them, and that's just to make it easier. When we make the bracha, it's quicker and everybody has it in front of them. But when we talk about a kirat shulchan, you only do it b'fnei misha omer haggadah, the head of the table. Rav Huna amar kulu nami l'fnei misha omer haggadah. He says you don't even need your own matzah maror. All of that just goes in front of the Baal Haggadah. Now, even according to the first opinion, nowadays that we have one big table, you only need one at the table. Now you might say, according to this though, if you have multiple tables, right, or you have one table, your big table, right? This happens a lot at Seder, and then you add all these folding tables and they look like separate tables. Maybe each table should have its own Seder plate on it. Again, that would be not according to Rav Huna, but it would be according to the first opinion. And in fact, the Gemara says, Hilchatake Rav Huna, it's enough just to have one. So you don't necessarily need this, but maybe it's nicer. Now they say, Lama ukrim et hashulchan, why do we uproot the table? Amri debei Rabbi Yana, kadesh yakiru tinokot v'yishalu. Our classic, we want the children to ask, so we do something, right? It's very odd. In the beginning of the meal, we be, right? Well, when do you akirat shulchan? You do that at the end of the meal. You don't do it at the beginning of the meal, right? For us, it's a little bit different because we don't actually remove the table. We just take off the Seder plate. It's a little less strange because everything else is still on the table. But there, they used to just remove the whole table. Here's a story. He was sitting before Rabbah. Saw that they took the table off from Rabbah. Okay, remember, he was adopted by Rabbah and he was obviously young when this story happened. We haven't even eaten. What are you doing taking the table off? Rabbah says, oh, you've exempted me from manishtana, which we're going to get to tomorrow. This idea that if the questions are already asked and the children are already involved, you actually don't have a need to say manishtana. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. Last thing for today, Amar Shmuel. Now we're on a new topic, Lefemoni. What is Lefemoni? This is kind of a prelude to what we're going to see tomorrow. Lechem she'onim alav dvarim. It's matzah that tells a story. Okay, why is it called Lefemoni? Oni from the language of onim, answer. So it has a lot of answers in it. It tells us the story of Pesach. Tanya namihache, there's a bright to support this. Lefemoni, lechem she'onim alav dvarim harbe. Tavar acher, there's another interpretation. What is that? Lechem oni aniktiv. It says it without a vav. We actually saw this in the beginning of the Masechet. Ma'anisha darko b'prusa, afkam b'prusa. Just like a poor person eats just pieces. Okay, different explanations. Why? If you're poor and someone gives you, right, the main answer is always, someone gives you a big piece, you're going to save for tomorrow. You're going to only eat a little bit at a time. Another thing is, right, and this is why we break the matzah. We eat it like a prusa, right? We break the matzah. That's the whole thing that comes from here. Another reason is if you're poor, often you ask people for money or for food and they give you a little bit. You don't get a whole loaf. It's not like you go to the store and you buy what you need, or your master gives you, only what he gives you. Another answer, davar acher, ma darko shelani hu masik v'ishto ofa, af kanami hu masik v'ishto ofa. What else is similar about matzah and poor people? How do poor people don't, right? Sometimes I put on my oven, I preheat it and I forget, like I'm busy and it takes me a long time till I get things in the oven. I don't really care. It's a little bit more on the electricity bill. How much money is it really costing me? But if you're poor and it's an issue, you're not going to do that because you're wasting money, right? So how would they do it? In those days, they had their own firewood. So they would put it on, right? And he would do it while his wife was preparing the dough so that they wouldn't waste any time. It would be a way of like not wasting time so that they wouldn't waste the firewood. And therefore, the matzah has to be prepared in that way. And this for a totally different reason. It's because you want to make sure it doesn't become chametz. So that's what it means, lechem oni, like a poor person that cooks it very quickly. Okay, so there we have 3 explanations of what lechem oni is, why it's called lechem oni. And we'll get into tomorrow, is charoset a mitzvah? Is it not? Why do we have charoset? As we kind of talked about something today, but we'll get into other aspects. And then we'll get into the 4 questions and other things. So that's it for today. Have a great day, everyone.